Known in China as the Nanda corpse shredding case, the murder of freshman student Diao Aiqing is perhaps the most notorious and brutal unsolved case in modern China. On the 19th of January 1996, a street cleaner thought she got lucky when finding a bag of meat in the winter snow while she worked. Believing it was a sin to waste good meat, she took the bag home to clean it. She would stop and call the police on finding 3 human fingers. The meat was confirmed to be human flesh, and over the next few days police would find several more bags of human remains around the city of Nanjing. The flesh, limbs, head and internal organs had all been separated and put in different bags. The parts had been boiled and the bags were found in various locations in the city of Nanjing but close to the university campus. The police eventually would identify the remains as belonging to a 19-year-old first-year student at Nanjing University who had been missing for several days, Diao Aiqing. Diao Aiqing grew up in Taizhou City in Jiangsu Province on China's east coast. She was a solid student in her youth but would perform poorly in the college entrance exam the first time she took it. She gained admittance to Nanjing University after resitting the exam and elected to study secretarial and microcomputer application as her major. She would study in the College of Continuing Education and move on to the campus. In the dormitory, she was named the dorm director. The police started to interview classmates, dorm mates, teachers and anyone else who knew Diao Aiqing for some leads, and to trace her movements on the day she went missing. While over time some facts in the case have been distorted, the most common story of her movements that day are as follows. A number of girls in the dormitory building were punished for having electrical appliances in their dorm rooms. As dorm director, Diao Aiqing was also punished, which put her in a bad mood. She left the campus, skipping classes, but her bedsheets were left laid out, suggesting she intended to return to the campus later that evening. She was later seen on Qingdao Road, a residential area close to the university. Diao Aiqing was said to be a shy, quiet girl who had a small circle of friends on campus and had only been in Nanjing a few months, so it wasn't known if she knew people outside the university. After talking to people who knew her, there were no suspects. Police thought it would be unlikely to be someone inside the university anyway. Students and most teachers lived on campus in dorms, which wouldn't have afforded the killer the privacy and facilities to dismember the bodies so completely. Although typically the police at this time would try to keep a case like this private to prevent panic, in this case there was little point. Word had already spread of the remains and investigators needed the public's help. They had no cause of death, murder weapon, obvious suspects, physical evidence, or motive. They had to go looking door to door across the city for anybody suspicious or any potential witnesses. Due to how the body had been dismembered, all flesh removed from the bone and sliced into thin pieces, they focused on people with medical knowledge or butchers. The area of the city Diao Aiqing was less seen was a busy and affluent residential area. However, despite getting some leads of strange noises, smells or behavior from interviews, all would turn out to be unrelated to the case. The police would end up interviewing almost the entire city, but there would be nothing. They would go back to the disposal sites of the remains a number of times in desperation that they would find something they missed, but there was nothing new for them to go on. Slowly, they had to give up putting so many resources in finding the killer. Eventually, the crime would fade from the majority of people's minds. However, with the growth in popularity of posting blogs, the case would gain attention more than a decade later. In 2008, a forum was started with the name Diao Aiqing Bar, in which the first message was, "Diao Aiqing, I really miss you." Then on the popular Tianya forum, a poster named Black Mass published a 2,500-word post with the title, "Some Thoughts on the Nanda Mutilation Case." Black Mass seemed to have a lot of accurate knowledge about the case, among the more speculative parts leading many people to believe it could be the killer. Police would interview him, but he was only a child when the murder occurred. The attention this got would see a number of similar posts about the case crop up. One individual even went to the family of Diao Aiqing, pretending to be a police officer to interview them. In response, Nanjing media outlets released accurate articles on the case to help people dismiss the rumors and distortions about it. With no genuine suspect or reason for the crime, many people have speculated over who killed and dismembered Diao Aiqing. They range from high-ranking government officials, staff members at the university to family members. But each suspicion is easily dismissed. In 2016, with a 20-year limit for prosecution coming up, the Nanjing police announced they will continue to investigate the case until they find the person responsible. With so little evidence, it seems that this case will go the same way as the case it is most often compared to, the Black Dahlia case in America. and remain unsolved and subject to speculation for years to come. On December 26, 2007, police in Hongan County in Hubei province were called to investigate a crime at the Liming Lime factory in the village of Zhaojiawan. Officers were shocked to discover 8 bodies at the scene. It would set off a massive investigation that remains officially unsolved to this day. Worker at the factory Wang Fahua thought his workplace seemed a little quiet and lifeless as he walked to work that morning. Out in the countryside, the noise was usually easy to hear as he made his way to work. Walking into the factory, the body of his boss's wife lying in a pool of blood greeted him. Wang Fahua ran back to his home to call the police. Once the police arrived and searched the scene, they would quickly discover 7 more bodies in different areas of the factory. The victims ranged in age from 60 years old to only 9 years of age. The victims were Wang Shishu. He was the boss of the factory and 56 years old at the time of his death. His wife, whose body was found first, close to the gate, Chen Xiaorun, was 54. Wang Chunlian, who was the cousin of the boss Wang Shishu, 32 years old, and her husband Wu Xiaofa, 33 years old. The youngest victim was the son of Wang Chunlian and Wu Xiaofa, who was only 9 years old. The final 3 victims were all 60 years old and worked in the factory's kiln. They were Yuan Mao, Wang Shijun, and Huang Shigui. Most of the victims suffered knife wounds and blunt force trauma. Forensic evidence would later show they were beaten before having their throats cut, and they were all found in different rooms in the factory. The only exception was Wu Xiaofa. Wu Xiaofa was found along the road leading to the factory about 100 meters away. His body was found next to his motorbike. He was leaving the factory when he was killed. Fingers had been severed from one of his hands and were strewn across the road, and he had several other knife wounds. Also, the trousers he was wearing had fallen or were pulled down. Police later found out the pants he was wearing were several sizes too big for him, and he wasn't wearing a belt with him. Wang Fahua told police all the victims had been at the factory the previous night. They were going to eat dinner together, but Wang Fahua decided not to stay and went back to his home. Forensic evidence showed that all the victims ate before their death, and they estimated that all were killed within an hour of each other. At the crime scene, there was little evidence to go on. The police found what they thought were the murder weapons, but there weren't any fingerprints on them. Footprints were found that didn't belong to anyone else at the scene, but only one set, meaning an individual intruder killed all 8 victims. The worker who discovered the crime scene, Wang Fahua, quickly fell under suspicion. Yet he had an alibi for the evening and so was just as quickly dismissed as a suspect. With little physical evidence to go off, the police started looking at possible motives. Even here, the police ran into a dead end. The boss of the factory, Wang Shishu, was well liked in the village and didn't seem to have any conflicts with anyone. In a small village like this, most people knew each other, and the police couldn't find anyone who had an issue with any of the victims. Wang Shishu had recently decided to sell the factory. This was so he could move to Wuhan to spend more time with his youngest son. He had agreed a price of 150,000 RMB, a massive sum at the time, which could easily make him a target for a robbery, since the deal would likely be done in cash. This information had only been shared with people working in the factory, so police began looking again at employees. Then police would finally get a clue. Some time back, 15,000 RMB had been stolen. The person strongly suspected for this was Wu Xiaofa, the husband of the boss's cousin and the only person killed outside the factory. This brought the police to suspect Wu Xiaofa had left the factory on his motorbike to go and get an accomplice. At some point, the accomplice turned on Wu Xiaofa and killed him to keep the money for himself and not worry about anyone going to the police. Investigations would show that Wu Xiaofa did have a number of friends with criminal records, but each investigation would come to nothing. It wouldn't be until 2016 that a special task force would come up with the most likely suspect. When police looked at the crime scene again, they noted that only the body of Huang Shigui was covered up by the killer. Then, when looking at the footprint comparison of people living in the village, they found that one individual gave a first footprint of size 40 and a second of size 42. The name of the man was Huang Shifei. Huang Shifei had a business relationship with the factory, was a friend of Wu Xiaofa and cousin to the body covered up, Huang Shigui. Huang Shifei was arrested and would allegedly confess the crime, saying he wore larger shoes on the day of the massacre to fool police. Just when it seemed that the crime finally had an answer, Huang Shifei died while in detention, leaving the case without a truly satisfying solution. In November 1994, after a birthday dinner with her father, Zhu Ling, a student studying in the chemistry department of Qinghua University, started suffering stomach pains. Initially, she ignored the pain, but over the coming weeks her symptoms would severely worsen and she fell into a coma. It would eventually be discovered that someone had poisoned her with the chemical element metal, thallium. Born in 1973, Zhu Ling grew up in a successful family. Both her mother and father were university graduates. Her father a geophysicist and her mother an engineer. As well as being academically gifted, she also showed aptitude in music and sports. Both Zhu Ling and her older sister Wu Jin would be admitted to the top universities in China. Zhu Ling to Qinghua and her sister to Beijing. However, the family would meet with tragedy when Wu Jin died in mysterious circumstances on a school field trip. Due to her sister's death, Zhu Ling decided to study at Qinghua, along with Beijing, one of the top universities in the country. Zhu Ling was studying in the Department of Chemistry and was considered one of the top students. She was also in the university folk band where she would perform on the traditional Chinese instrument, the guzheng. The birthday dinner she had with her father was not just to celebrate her birthday but also to congratulate her on being chosen to play a solo piece on the guzheng in an upcoming performance of the university band. After her performance, her symptoms would get much worse. She had pains in her legs, making it almost impossible to walk, and her hair was falling out. After a month in hospital, she made a decent recovery, but on returning to university after the Spring Festival her illness returned, only this time much worse. By March, as doctors struggled to find answers, she suffered paralysis and slipped into a coma. Her parents tried a number of hospitals and doctors to try and save their daughter. At this time in China, having any internet access was very rare. However, an old high school classmate of Zhu Ling, who was also studying in Qinghua, was in the Department of Mechanics. This meant they could go online. The friend, Bei Zhicheng, translated the symptoms into English and sent messages to doctors worldwide. Within hours he would have the answer. Thallium is highly toxic, and while it is used in everyday items like various electronics and fiber optics, it also has use as rat poison. Being colorless, tasteless and odorless, it once had the nickname the poisoner's poison. After being informed of the online diagnosis, the parents of Zhu Ling asked doctors to test for thallium. Their request was dismissed at first. They eventually found a doctor willing to do the test, and the result came back. Zhu Ling had a lethal level of the poison in her body. Zhu Ling was given the antidote, a pigment known as Prussian blue, and would wake from her coma some weeks later. However, the damage done to her was irreversible. She remained paralyzed from the waist down, blinded and left with severe neurological damage. She would require care for the rest of her life. Now the question was how so much thallium got into her system. At first the belief was, since she studied in the Department of Chemistry, she may have come into contact with it there. But this was almost impossible. Thallium was a highly controlled substance. Only 200 people nationwide had access to it. Out of those 200, 7 were at Qinghua University. One of those 7 shared a dorm room with Zhu Ling. The number one suspect, in fact the only real suspect, was called Sun Wei, but later changed her name to Sun Shiyan. Dorm mates with Zhu Ling, another player of the guzheng in the folk band, and one of only 200 people across China to have access to thallium. Sun Wei maintains her innocence to this day, and has left messages online about how she hopes the poisoner will be brought to justice one day. It took the police 2 years after the parents of Zhu Ling reported the poisoning to investigate Sun Wei. They released her after only a few hours, citing insufficient evidence to charge her. The lack of evidence is partly due to a robbery that happened in the dorm room of Zhu Ling and Sun Wei sometime after the poisoning was reported. A week after the parents of Zhu Ling contacted them, the police would go to the dorm to look for evidence. Unfortunately, the thieves only took items belonging to Zhu Ling in the robbery. Also, the thieves must have found it thirsty work, as they made sure to take the cups Zhu Ling used to drink water and tea. Due to the lack of evidence against her, Sun Wei would be cleared as a suspect by the police, who would offer another possible poisoner. However, there would be no further arrests in the case. As an aside, it is interesting to note that Sun Wei came from an extremely prominent family, with several relations being in or very close to the government. A few years after, Sun Wei changed her name and emigrated to America, where she remains to this day. In 2008, the father of Zhu Ling contacted police to see if there was any progress in the case. He was informed that the case had been closed 10 years ago and the police had stopped looking for the poisoner. Since the poisoning, The parents of Zhu Ling have been almost full-time carers for their daughter. Now in their 80s, they know they don't have much time left. They hope that they can see justice before their time comes to an end. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider like, subscribing, and commenting. And we hope to see you again for the next one.